This is the Amaazen Outdoors podcast. I hope you like the new digs with the intro. This is episode 9. I hope you guys like everything. I spent a little money the other day and upgraded a little bit of equipment, so audio quality should be at its finest. I got a little bit of new intro music. It just kind of grew on me the other day, so I hope you all like it. This is a really unique episode. I wasn't aware of this until recently, a couple years ago. And when I started the podcast, I had an idea about doing a mini-series kind of on Wisconsin's native birds. I hope all you guys saw the YouTube video. If you haven't, check it out. Amaazen Outdoors on YouTube. I was going to do some voiceover, but I just wanted to get it out on the same day that I saw it. I had the awesome opportunity of viewing a sharp-tailed lek up in northwest Wisconsin. And the video is pretty cool. It shows those birds dancing, and I got some pretty good audio of some up-close action with Wisconsin sharp-tailed grouse on a lek. It was really cool. So today's episode, I sit down with Alaina Gerrits of the Wisconsin DNR. She's the Assistant Upland Bird Ecologist. Anyways. I recorded this a couple weeks ago in kind of preparation for a few interviews I had lined up. I had a fantastic interview with another guy here in Minnesota today. I really wanted to push that one out first, but I owe it to Elena. I got to get this out. This is a great interview. Couple things, house cleaning stuff. Jason, the guy that's going to come on board as a sponsor, he's had some family stuff, and I got super busy with a couple other endeavors I got and haven't been really active on social media either. So apologize about all that, but we're wrapping up the sponsorship deal and the affiliate marketing, and he's going to come on board and we're going to help market each other's companies. So it's going to be a lot of fun. The podcast is really, really excited to have somebody on board, and Jason's got a really good story and a good brand and an American made product. So we really like that kind of stuff around here. I'm going to hit the roll button here with Elena. Enjoy. And again, I hope you guys are all enjoying the outdoors and have some more good stuff coming up. I got a lot of stuff in editing right now. So my good buddy Jeff Nuss and I actually, before I hit the roll button, we sat down with a guy today, and he really, really cool story about basically like the one guy saving Minnesota's Bob White Quail. So I think I'm going to roll that story out a little quicker than I thought. I might drop it off normal days on Wednesday and just kind of be an add-in drop-in with guest host Jeff Nuss. So enjoy today's show. Reach out if you got some comments or want to learn more. I might be able to hook you up with the right folks if you have a heart for prairie chickens and want to donate to the cause here in Wisconsin. I think they could use some funds. There is a 10-year plan coming out that you'll hear about a little bit in the show. If you're in Wisconsin and you care about the prairie chickens, please look out for it in the DNR's comments from the public. I think it's going to be a team effort to try to save those birds, and I think they're worth it. So enjoy today's show with Elena. Got Alaina Gerrits from Wisconsin DNR. This is the Amaazen Outdoor podcast. So Elena, give us an introduction to who you are and what you do for a living.
Yeah, so my name is Alaina Gerrits. I am the Assistant Upland Wildlife Ecologist for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. I was born and raised in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and grew up hunting and fishing with my family and decided to pursue a career in wildlife ecology. So I got my bachelor's degree at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, and then I traveled around the country for a few years doing tech jobs all over the country. I worked in New Mexico, Oklahoma, and then I decided to go to graduate school. I got my master's degree from Louisiana State University studying turkey movement ecology, and worked in South Carolina doing turkey research for a couple years. And then I moved back to Wisconsin, my home state, where I specialize in upland game birds. So things like turkeys, ruffed grouse, prairie chickens, pheasants, and then small game such as rabbits, hares, and squirrels.
Wonderful. So all the fun little critters.
Yeah, the little ones that are a little less controversial as well.
Well, some of them have their own controversies, but some of them have none.
That's true.
I suppose, though, there could be an argument for the squirrel controversy. I mean, plenty of them bug me in the fall in the deer stand, and those darn red squirrels they don't like it, and they're noisy about it.
Oh yeah, they'll trick you out every time.
They're like the security alarm for the woods, you know.
Yeah.
Somebody has entered.
Yeah.
Well, anyways, we got connected because I'm trying to kind of shed some light on a few different birds in Wisconsin that are kind of unique. You hear about guys out west shooting sharptails and prairie chickens, and up until recently there was a sharptail season, and I can't. You're gonna get into some of the history on prairie chickens here, but I don't know that the average hunter, or really maybe possibly the average listener here to the podcast, really understands that there are prairie chickens in Wisconsin and how unique the story is to them and kind of how special it is. And it's just a unique story. So that's kind of how we got connected. And we kind of had a pre-show kind of call last week, and some of the stuff you had mentioned was just very unique and interesting that I didn't even know. So share with us some of the history on Wisconsin's prairie chickens, and how did we get them and what happened to them and whatnot. So we kind of talked about there was a boom to bust scenario. So I've got some questions along the way, but yeah, why don't you give us a rundown of the history?
Sure. So before Europeans settled in Wisconsin way back in the day, Wisconsin was mostly covered with forests. And in the early 1900s, late 1800s, when we really started to settle the state, there was an event called the Great Cutover that we talk about in history books a lot. And that was when a lot of family farmers decided to cut down a lot of the forested landscape in the state. And basically, we tried to farm everything. We were all the way up north trying to farm. We were all over the state, basically cutting down forests and putting them under plow to try and make farming a suitable practice across the landscape. And that had some negative impacts for some species, but for greater prairie chickens, it had a pretty positive impact. And in the early 1900s until about the 50s or 60s, we've seen that most of the land that was within agriculture was things like grass-based agriculture, like haying and grazing of cattle. There was a lot of small grains, like cereal grains, that were being farmed. And those type of habitats were really conducive to greater prairie chickens. Chickens are an area-sensitive species, so they thrive in really, really wide open, vast landscapes, especially grassland landscapes. So for a long time, we've seen really thriving populations of chickens. We had hunting seasons that dated back quite a while, and our most recent hunting season was in 1955 in Wisconsin. But now, starting in the 70s and on, and really even just in the last couple of decades, we have seen a huge shift away from grass-based agriculture, away from small grains, towards traditional row crop agriculture. And in central Wisconsin, where our last remaining population of chickens exists, we've been seeing a transition to center pivot agriculture, things like potatoes and corn, soybeans, and stuff like that. That's really not conducive to chickens. It's pretty inhospitable. It doesn't provide the habitat that they need to complete their life cycles. So in the last few decades, we've seen even a really large decline in population numbers, and now we do prairie chicken surveys every spring, and we're down to about 200 lecking males we see on an annual basis. So it's really a remnant population at this point in Wisconsin.
Yeah, we kind of talked earlier that they're just, even if you guys tried to make a huge effort at it, there just isn't the habitat left in the state to even make an impact to put a recreational kind of effort for hunters back into the mix. It's just definitely it's a sad story in a sense, but again, our habitat is, I think, a lot more, at least there's more trees than in larger farms today than the kind of the family farms. So can you explain that kind of big cutover and kind of walk us through a little bit of the agricultural aspect of it? You know, when you mentioned family farm back in the early days of settlement here, what is a family farm today, or back in the 1800s, late 1800s, versus the farms today? And because today row crop is a lot more valuable from obviously production is way different from the 1800s, but size is different too, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, really, even if you just talk to your grandparents or your great grandparents, if you're lucky enough to still have them around, most people in Wisconsin were involved in agriculture in some form in the early 1900s to turn of this like mid-century. And so our farms were smaller. Like you said, they were smaller in acreage because they would be owned by a single family, and your neighbor would be a farmer and his neighbor was a farmer. And we were a lot more involved in things like I said, small grains and cereal crops, but then also grazing cattle. That was a lot more popular back then. Smaller sized farms with less intensive management. And now we see a huge shift away from that. So the number of farms in Wisconsin has gone down drastically, but the average size has gone up, and they're more industrial. They're company-owned farms. They're industrialized operations that use equipment that is incredibly efficient, but also takes a lot of the value for wildlife away. Like the litter that would be left on the field is completely cleaned up. We're tilling our fields constantly. Some farms don't leave like standing stubble over the winter, which can provide wildlife habitat. We've seen this huge shift to clean farming, where things like field edges and field borders that, would be shrubby and have taller grass, which provided excellent habitat for things like pheasants and other birds, they're completely gone. I mean, we're capitalizing on every square inch of land that we're farming. So it's just been a really large shift. And again, that shift to industrial farming has been in the last couple of decades. And that's why we've seen this pretty precipitous dip in chickens and other grass and wildlife species in the last couple of decades.
So I have to ask that edge crop or clean farming and the productivity, some of the listeners, the podcast has listeners, not many right now, but enough that they're all over the country. And you think about a listener down in Kansas who drives through central Kansas, and every single field is more or less, either no-till or they leave wintering stubble, and they leave edge crops, and not all of them, but they're much larger section farms with much more vastness, but they leave hedgerows and fence lines, and with the thought of utilizing every square inch of land for row crop and the detriment that has on wildlife in general in Wisconsin. Why is that practice so prevalent in Wisconsin versus, even in some places that I see here in Minnesota versus that kind of practice? There's obviously areas in Minnesota that kind of utilize this as well. Is it solely these large corporations and, bottom dollars that are making those decisions? Or is there something that has kind of slipped through the cracks?
I can't speak to that too much.
I know it's a
Don't
deep
come from
question.
a farming.
I'm kind of, I don't want to put you on something that you don't want to talk too much about, but it is kind of, I thought, unique to some of the farming practices I found in central Wisconsin. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I would say again, I can't speak to it too much because I don't come from like a farming or agricultural background myself, but it's, it's hard. The world that we live in right now, I just read some statistic in a paper today about how by 2050 there's going to be like 10 billion people on Earth or some ridiculous number like that. And the number of farms is going down. So we really do need to capitalize on every acre. And I don't want to demonize farmers in this because they're obviously the backbone of our country. But I think we're doing a really good job by starting to turn the page on some of these conservation practices you can incorporate into farming. And one of the most promising programs that I've read about in Wisconsin is precision agriculture. And Pheasants Forever is one of the non-governmental organizations that's standing behind this program, and it's working with private farmers to look at all of their fields that they plant and look at those areas that are not giving them a lot of return on an investment, whether it's too wet or it's too dry or whatever conditions topography is making it so that some corner of the field is you're actually losing money because you're putting more money into seed planting it than you're getting back from it. And we're looking at taking those field edges or those wet borders and planting those back into either something like a cover crop or native grass to foster little bits of wildlife habitat while still increasing actually the farmer's revenue. So there's all sorts of programs with NRCS and Farm Bill biologists and Pheasants Forever to capitalize on small little projects that you can do to both increase your revenue potentially as a farmer and increase wildlife habitat. So I think we are starting to turn the page. We're realizing that, topsoil as a whole in the whole nation is really going to the wayside, and we need to do some more sort of conservation-like practices to be able to continue farming into the future as well.
I definitely agree with you that there's a conscious effort being made. It's part of the reason I started the podcast is to kind of create awareness about some of these things. But in talking with some of the Pheasant Forever guys, I actually had one of the local field biologists out to my property last Friday, and it's they have a lot of resources available for the private landowner and farms to take advantage of exactly what you just said. And their grant money, there's help that they can help staff you to do some of this work. It's really amazing how much money has started to come into that effort through Pheasants Forever, and actually Rough Grouse Society, even just from the timber management standpoint as well. So it's there, and it's just I hope we can make that long-term shift to find common ground in all this, because it is that edge crop. It's those edge rows. It's the native grasslands. It's the cover crops that basically create the insects, create the forbs, create all of the right recipes to hold wildlife, and not just birds. It's deer. It's everything else that comes around. You think about 40 acres just in standing corn, and where do you tend to see all your wildlife congregate is around those edges. So it's good to hear, and it's a sad story from a certain sense, but as long as we understand the history on some of this stuff, we can apply new practices and turn this corner and really make an impact, I think, long term. So
yeah, absolutely.
So with that, why does Wisconsin still have birds? I guess when did some of the conservation efforts for these prairie chickens, you mentioned, I think it was 1955 was like the last recreational hunt on these birds.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously something happened then, but there's a couple groups I think you mentioned as well that have an effort here, and who are you all working with that kind of, obviously what we still have these birds because people have gotten involved years ago for some kind of conservation effort.
Yeah, there's always been a fascination and I would say a cultural and historical context related to prairie chickens in Wisconsin. And it goes back to really the 30s and 40s and into the 50s. There was a husband and wife team, the Hammerstroms, that researched prairie chickens and brought them to the forefront of wildlife biology as a whole. And they're still regarded as some of the best chicken researchers that the nation has ever seen. And they were based out of central and southern Wisconsin. So I think there's always been a fascination with them. There's always been conservation efforts directed towards them. Specifically in the last couple of decades, there's been a few organizations that have been pivotal in managing these species and making sure that they are still on the landscape. And, one of those would definitely be the Department of Natural Resources. Basically the areas where we still have chickens today in Wisconsin are on 4 wildlife management areas that are owned and managed by the DNR in central Wisconsin. And those properties are specifically managed for prairie chickens. That is the goal of the whole master plan for the whole property, is to proliferate prairie chickens. For 3 of those properties, that's the main goal of having the property at all. So they're really actively managed with prescribed fire and herbicide applications. There's some grazing operations with local producers that take place on those lands, brushing, all sorts of habitat management, really actively keeping grass on the landscape. And that's honestly, truthfully, that's the only reason why they still exist in Wisconsin today, is because there are those large tracts of public land that still exist and are still in grass. But, we couldn't have done that without help from our partners. So people like the Dane County Conservation League, they actually purchased some land next to Buena Vista Wildlife Area, and they gave us a lease for it so that we can continue to manage for wildlife. That was a donation they made, and that continues to be managed for prairie chickens. There's other organizations like University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. They have a program called Becoming an Outdoors Woman that takes people out to go view the prairie chickens on Lex every spring. That helps raise awareness. I know that they do a lot at the university. When I went there for my bachelor's, they do a lot to promote them and the importance of grassland habitat work. There's the Wisconsin Society for Ornithology. They help us with research-based needs. They give us advice on, which research topics we need to be looking at. We've done research with UW-Madison in the central Wisconsin area. So truthfully, it's people who are passionate about them and they collaborate with us and help form these partnerships. That's the only reason that we can continue doing this today, because since they are a state-threatened species and we can't hunt them, we're not getting revenue off of them like we would a game species. So like, turkeys or ruffed grouse, they get managed via hunting license sales, and we don't have that for prairie chickens. So we really have to rely on donors and partnerships and things like that.
It's a daunting effort when you start thinking about there's only, 4 wildlife management areas that you guys have these birds at. And so it sounds like there's at least, efforts being done. You guys have done a great job over the last number of decades. Where in Wisconsin are these wildlife management areas? I personally kind of know where they are, but some of the listeners might not. So they might be at this point, can the podcast be wondering a little bit where in Wisconsin these birds are?
Yep. So the wildlife areas are Buena Vista, Meade, Paul J. Olson, and Leola, and it spans over a couple of counties in central Wisconsin. It would be like Portage, Adams, Juneau, a little bit of Wood County, all right in the very middle of the state there.
Sure. So some of that habitat was traditionally, also that I think farmed for cranberries. Am I correct with that?
Yep, that's accurate. There's still some cranberry farms in that area now.
Yeah, that type of farming is very it changes the landscape completely. They use a lot of retention ponds and stuff to farm cranberries. Obviously, that's made an impact over the years to some of the habitat. So you just have less to work with.
Yep, definitely. And I would say we've seen a larger increase in row crop agriculture than we have in cranberry production,
Okay.
but neither are very hospitable to chickens.
No, yeah. Row crop's not very good as we either. I guess to back up a little bit too, understanding a little bit more about the prairie chicken in itself, the importance of these leks that they dance on in the spring and some of the unique displays that they have. And it's really kind of why I think once you see it, people really resonate or go, this is beautiful. It's a lot like a turkey strutting, but way more. I mean, people understand how sharptails dance as well, so it's very similar. But the lek itself, the area that they dance on, the importance of not disturbing that particular lek is like paramount. I understand that if that lek is disturbed, put into row crop, and if it was ever put back into CRP, that they have an extremely hard time establishing a lek in that spot again. Is that correct?
That's absolutely true. Lekking species are very sensitive. Lek sites are basically their home base, and everything revolves around that. Females will typically nest very close to the lekking site, so when they go to the lek and they're bred, they're not going to travel very far to their nest site. So not only does there need to be like short grass that's suitable for displaying on the lek, there needs to be a little bit taller grass with some more leaf litter to facilitate nesting close nearby. So when we do management, we focus it around the lek sites. That's what a lot of research has shown is if you want to get the best bang for your buck in managing chickens, you want to do things as close to the lek sites as you can, not just randomly across the landscape. And these species are really unique in the lekking behavior, and things like sharp-tailed grouse and chickens, we've done research on translocating them. And they have a really hard time with that because they're so used to their one lek site that they basically use their whole lives, that if you translocate them, sometimes they'll just wander for miles looking for a new lek site. And it's really hard for them to establish a new territory or a new lekking site. So once you do have a lek site that you know exists and you know where it is, it's really important to keep those protected. They do have a really hard time establishing new lek sites.
Yeah, I was doing in research to this kind of little podcast mini series about Wisconsin's native birds. That was one of the. Actually, I think I actually heard it in some Minnesota stuff that I was reading with the Minnesota Sharptail Society and how it applied to the lekking kind of bird species, and even with sage grouse as well. I heard very similar. Problems that they have with relocating birds with new habitat restoration projects. So it's like I said, paramount that whatever we do to conserve these birds, that it's understood that if you have prairie chickens that have a lek on your property, that you need to be aware of that, and that's how the habitat in itself kind of comes into full front and play with managing these birds. And with habitat management, how do you, with a lek site in smaller properties like this, and having a bird that has really a need for so much space, how do you build in like winter cover? What do chickens need in the winter time? Because we have a very harsh winter compared to some of the other places where these birds range.
We do. Yeah, so we found that so species like sharp-tailed grouse, they're closely related, but they're not the same species, obviously. And species like sharp-tailed grouse like more brushy, woody, shrubby cover for winter and things like that. And I think that is a good example for Wisconsin because we have sharp-tailed grouse in the northwestern part of the state where our winter is really the harshest. And then in central Wisconsin, where winter conditions are a little less harsh, we have the prairie chickens. And studies have shown that even over winter, prairie chickens don't really prefer shrubby or forested habitat. So they really rely on the structure of like old dead grass or sometimes things like crop stubble, like especially for small grains, can provide some kind of like structure for them to stay warm and dry and everything in the winter. And basically they kind of just make it work. I think that studies have shown overwinter mortality is not really a driving force for prairie chicken population growth. Things like nesting and breeding success are those vital rates that are really influencing their overall population growth. And, that's not true for another species. For comparison would be like the quail, the bobwhite quail in Wisconsin. We really think that part of the reason why they're not here anymore is not only because of the lack of adequate grassland habitat, but also because our winters are getting harsher and more sporadic. So bottom line, we need to do more research, but we think that overall, if we can get more contiguous large tracts of grassland, they'll be able to better handle things like climatic conditions and predation, disease, that sort of thing.
That's, you referenced bobwhite quail, so I have to ask a question in related. I know quail in themselves, obviously temperature is part of it, but I was talking to a few biologists from Missouri, and he basically said kind of the same thing that you did regarding quail. As long as they don't have big ice storms or they still have access to scratch for grain or some kind of stubble to eat, temperature doesn't necessarily affect them, and that the habitat in itself, if you build good habitat, your loss for winter birds is really not a non-factor. So it's wonderful to kind of hear that there's some similarities, at least. Obviously we still don't have bobwhite quail here, and that's for a number of different reasons, and probably because we get too much snow up here, I think, and too many varying conditions versus you go down south another 100, 200 miles. It's they just have more access to open cover.
Yeah, definitely.
So with this effort and maybe not a lot of people understanding how small of an area this is for Wisconsin, what can, we kind of talked about what makes up good habitat and, what, these birds kind of need and a little bit of their background here. In the future, moving forward, is there an effort to get these birds to somewhere where you might have some type of recreational hunt so you could get access for some additional funding?
Well, I think that would be the ultimate goal. But where we're at right now is so very, very far away from that's not our focus. The department is
obviously can't put a focus on that if it's not, you're not able to get there. You have to build the habitat. That has to be kind of the focus in order to get these birds in a direction.
Basically, we have a lot of steps and a lot of goals that need to be completed before we can even think about that.
So speaking to those steps and goals, is there anything our listeners can do or hunters can do to advocate for these birds?
Absolutely. I would say one of the biggest things is to just get involved. So the DNR is currently in the process of revising our 10-year management plan for the greater prairie chicken. There's going to be a series of public meetings and public comment periods where people can speak up and voice their concerns. Grassland habitat, not only for prairie chickens, but for a host of other species, is one of the fastest declining habitats in the state. And I would say another really great thing to do would be get involved with these different nonprofit and non-governmental organizations that are really helping us lead the fight in this. Like I mentioned before, our Farm Bill biologists with Pheasants Forever are actively working with private landowners to incorporate grassland habitat management into their working lands approaches and enrolling them in programs like the Conservation Reserve Program and other Farm Bill programs. So supporting groups like Pheasants Forever, specific to Wisconsin, the Dane County Conservation League I spoke about, There's a Prairie Chicken Festival that happens every year that I think might be underway this week or was last week, and you can donate to that cause. You can just participate and just voice your opinion as a sportsman, because, even though we might not have a huntable population of prairie chickens, these practices are going to help a host of other wildlife species, including things like pheasants, but also, like you mentioned earlier, edge species like deer and those sort of things that rely on the edge around farms as well, that would benefit from more conservation-based agriculture.
Absolutely. The call of the Uplands would kind of started a few weeks into my podcast, and I was really in a heavily research phase at that point and trying to come up with some ideas, and they really inspired me, the effort that they're working on with Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever, with I see the job posts on LinkedIn constantly. There's a ton of money in this effort to work hand in hand with farmers. And to me, it really gets me excited to think about the future and what we all can do. So that was my first call when I was looking at building out of the city on 30 acres. And I called, who are the field biologists for the groups that I support, and who else is available to me to educate me about what I can do personally to grow the habitat that I want to see locally on my farm, and the impacts that makes for the farms next to me. And as we work as hunters and landowners and people who care about this species, or more of these edge species, we just absolutely need to support these groups and get involved at the local chapter level.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't recommend that enough. And the bottom line, especially for prairie chickens in Wisconsin, is they are such an area sensitive species. So even if their home range is a couple hundred acres as an individual bird, they need to have thousands of acres surrounding their home ranges that are just beautiful, wide open grassland habitat. So we don't own that much land in Wisconsin and central Wisconsin where they exist. So we have to collaborate with private landowners that are nearby, producers, and other land ownership types, because without collaboration and partnership, not only is DNR not going to have a large enough budget to go out and purchase enough grassland acres to make this population viable, but B, you have to collaborate and cooperate on a landscape scale for pretty much any species, but especially for an area sensitive species like chickens.
Well, and speaking of that, maybe back to a little bit of more of the habitat and the biology part of this bird, but they need the difference in genetic makeup at some point at such a small scale on a couple hundred acres. They're mating with cousins, and there just is not enough biodiversity within their own gene pool to withstand changes in the environment over time. Eventually, it gets to, I believe, there's just not enough new genetics coming into the population. Am I correct with that assumption?
Yep, I would say mostly that's true. There has been some new research that's come out of Minnesota that has shown that that's not quite as imperative and critical as we used to think it was. Several years ago at this point, we did translocate some chickens into the state from a donor state to try and amp up those genetics. And we didn't really see a long-lasting impact on genetic fitness. It wasn't like a quick fix that was really easy. We found in very recent research that the more and better habitat that you can create, it's going to fix itself. It's going to kind of work itself out. The genetic side of it is less imperative to their biology than we once thought. Obviously, it is critical. And if this species continues to decline, then it's going to be the demise of them. But at this point, habitat is our key focus. It's the best thing that we can do to help their fitness overall.
I don't know. I keep coming back to habitat, habitat.
Mhm.
It's very, very important. It's the key to everything. Every single problem that these species face seems to be able to be solved with improving their habitat.
For sure. And I would say that it's almost every wildlife species. I mean, almost every single one. I work with ruffed grouse as well. And a couple of years ago, there was some news stories about West Nile virus coming through the population. And there's some folks out in Pennsylvania who think that that's having a pretty significant impact on their population. And our studies have just shown over and over again that the larger your population is and the more habitat you have and the higher quality it is, they're going to be just so much more well suited to protect themselves from all sorts of different variables. Like we talk about controlling predators, which yes, of course, that can have an impact, but as long as they have suitable habitat where they can avoid predators and they can overcome diseases, it's the key to all of this. It's not dissimilar from thinking about if you have a cold as a human, if you're sick, you have the flu or you have a cold and you're homeless and you're trying to keep yourself warm and feed yourself on top of having this flu or cold, something as simple as a flu or cold could take you out. Whereas if you have a house that's warm and you have a well-stocked fridge, then you're not going to worry about a cold or flu because you're going to be able to overcome it like nothing.
Exactly. We go to Kansas every year, and in the last couple of years, we've kind of seen a big boom in predator bird species. A lot of owls, a lot of hawks, and they seem to be way more than we used to see. And I personally haven't seen a decline other than what are some of the normal variables there due to that. And I always kind of wondered how that affected the predation of birds. And how the natural cycles of these things go. And, if it comes back to habitat, because if pheasants have somewhere to winter cover, if deer have somewhere to winter cover, they can get through these harsh conditions. These things live outdoors. They live for, it's what they do for a living is they live in this environment. We have these nice houses that, keep us warm and get us over the flu. But it's so tightly tied to habitat. The more and more I do research, the more and more I find it's amazing what wildlife will do if you give them the right circumstances.
Yeah, exactly, for sure.
This winter was pretty harsh, and I have actually been kind of out doing a little trout fishing, and I've actually seen quite a few birds of prey that look like they didn't make it through the winter this year along some of the trout streams in southern Minnesota and western Wisconsin. So they go through cycles as well. So people always get hung up on some of the predation stuff, and I think it just swings and ebbs and flows with kind of nature as they do, and just with all species. If you can impact the landscape to give these animals the best circumstance that they can to survive, they're going to survive, and not only survive, they'll thrive.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they evolve together. That's, it's a different species if there's an invasive predator on the landscape or something that's not native to the area. But when you talk about birds of prey and things like prairie chickens or pheasants or whatever else, they evolve together. They can tolerate one another, and we're certainly not going to pursue something like a bird of prey control program either. So I think people do focus on predator control. It's like an easy scapegoat, and it's a complicated problem because there's things like depressed fur markets that are inhibiting trappers from getting out there and doing it. But at the end of the day, that's not going to make or break a population. If they are susceptible to more predation, it's because they don't have quality habitat to evade them. It's kind of the bottom line is habitat.
It is. Like I said, I keep coming back to habitat. So with the DNR, and you're kind of doing this as kind of maybe wrap this up here. You're revising your 10-year plan for these prairie chickens. Is there anything that people can do specifically with the DNR in these upcoming meetings? When does this all kind of kick off for people to be able to participate?
We're still in the preliminary stages of the plan right now. We've just recently engaged our advisory committee, and that has a bunch of stakeholders outside of the DNR, including grass-based agriculture and Pheasants Forever, NGOs, other people outside of government. And we are looking at the first draft of the plan. We're revising it, and then there should be something available for public consumption in the next couple of weeks. We haven't set any dates yet, but basically what will happen is the first draft of our plan will be posted on our website. We'll open probably a 60-day comment period where anyone from the public can send in a comment with their thoughts about the plan. And then there'll be likely virtual meetings where I'll give a presentation, and then there'll be a question and answer session. So if people want to talk to somebody, kind of in real time, that opportunity will be provided. But we don't have dates set just yet.
Well, please do. Some of the listeners here may want some of that information, and once there's some public comment, I might be able to do a quick 5-minute update for people and let them know. And then I'll also include some information in the show notes. So maybe afterwards you can send me a link or something that we can include so people can follow up on the internet in a few weeks.
Absolutely. That would be great.
So kind of in closing here, is there anything related to the prairie chicken that we haven't discussed today that you feel is important?
I'm sure I'm forgetting something, but I feel like we did a good job covering the bases. Like I said, habitat and partnerships, I think, are probably the two cornerstones of their management going into the future.
I think we did a good job with that. So, we kind of skipped over a little bit of who you do. You got kind of an interesting story, at least with some of what you have going on this fall. Do you have any big plans you want to share with the audience on kind of what you're doing this fall?
Just personally?
Yeah, personally. Yeah, you're a hunter. You got into this because into the DNR because you enjoy the outdoors. So everybody kind of likes to hear a little bit of hunting banter on the show. So if you don't mind sharing.
Oh, absolutely. Sure. So I grew up hunting with my dad in Marinette County. And I've always been into bow hunting for deer and turkey hunting in the spring. And now I've been dating this guy named Ryan for a couple of years, and he's really into hound hunting. So he has a pack of Platte hounds that he's been training and working with. He's been hound hunting his whole life. So I've been just dipping my toe into the hound hunting world. We do coyotes in the winter. He's really big into bear hunting in the summer and fall. So going out and training with the dogs, we went out to New Mexico last August, and I harvested my first bear there. And then we're going to be doing that again this year. And then he's going out to New Hampshire as well for a hunt. And on top of, I think they have 4 or 5 people they have planned going on hunts in Wisconsin. So hound hunting has been the new thing on my calendar for the fall, but it's been really exciting to get involved with, and still finding time to bow hunt and gun hunt for deer and spend time on the family property as well.
It's always a challenge. I got a couple German short-hair pointers a few years ago, and deer hunting for me kind of took a little bit of a back seat. We still do it, but I'm a little more selective on when I go into sit in the tree stand now. I usually save it for the end of November and first week or end of October, first week in November.
Yep, I hear you. That's the hardest part, is just finding time for all of it.
It is. We'll have to, have you back with your boyfriend on the podcast. I want to make an effort because I got a bear tag myself this fall, and I personally have only ever been bear hunting and done it with bait and sitting over the bait site. I've talked to a few hound hunters. It's not something I'm really too aware of, and in our pre-call you mentioned that, and I kind of tease a little bit of another podcast down the road here, but it's something that I would love to get you guys on and have a conversation about, because I have a lot of questions on just how it's done, how you train your dogs, and all of that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about it, and I think people are largely unaware of how much work it is and what a time commitment it is. And I think I think it would be good to spread awareness about it and maybe help some new people understand it and maybe get people involved in it as well, because it is something that is kind of dying off, unfortunately.
It is, and I agree with the misconception. It's just, I don't know. It's a predator hunting with dogs in a sense, I think has a misconception. And we don't need to get into that whole thing here today, but I would love to have you guys on to discuss it and talk about some of those issues. It's kind of amazing. I did the amount of species that these hounds can pursue. Do you guys do coons at all? You train on coons at all?
Yep, that's what we train our puppies on.
Yeah, so you get coons, you got coyotes, you've got a number of. I mean, it's really unique, and it is a huge commitment. I know how much of a commitment it is for my short hairs and just bird hunting. And I couldn't imagine a pack of hounds I got to take care of.
Yep, it's pretty much every weekend, and Ryan's lucky in his job that he can take a couple months off every year and really hone in on the skill. It's his whole life. It's a lifestyle for sure.
It is. It's kind of where I'm headed with the dogs too, and some of the opportunities I have. I've been able to finally put enough time into the dogs, and it's nice to see the result too. So. Well, anyways, Elena.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the most rewarding part is when you can watch a puppy catch on and figure it out and realize that that's what they were born to do. It's an incredible thing to watch.
Well, and I think too that's where a little bit of the lack of awareness in people today comes from. You know, there's all these different dog breeds out there. They were all bred for purposes and not just to sit around the house and be pretty. And understanding the fulfillment of just the dog in itself, it really doesn't matter what the outdoor recreating activity is. It's just really awesome to see those dogs fulfill that what they perceive is all they want to do. It doesn't matter what you do around the house. There's nothing. I had my dogs out training yesterday, and they know the minute we pull in, it was that we were there to play with birds. And they are just ear to ear grinning, laughing, fighting who's going to go first. And they absolutely love it. And it's I can't get them that excited here at home for anything. So.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think people think that sometimes dogs are just meant to be pets that just sit on the couch all day, and some of these dogs are just not bred to do that. They're bred to be working dogs, and that's what makes them the most happy.
I can't put it any other way better. So, well, Elena, it's been awesome chatting today. I don't have any other questions. I think we're probably going to be in conversation here maybe once or twice more. I'm going to be doing some stuff on sharp-tails and coordinating with another one of your coworkers. So I might have some smaller questions and a little shorter request for some of that stuff. And then I hope we can get you and your boyfriend Ryan on soon for bear hunting podcast. So that'd be awesome.
For sure.
Oh, yes. We got outro music now. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Amaazen Outdoors podcast. I'm doing this for you guys. I want to create awareness. I want to make sure that we have all these spaces and birds and animals that we love to hunt and enjoy nature, that we can share that with generations to come. So do your part, be a good steward, join the conservation effort. Now's the time. Come back for another episode. I got some really cool stuff on board. Oh yeah, no more crummy guide outro. But if you want to have a good time, hit me up.